Well, the popularity of unschooling and homeschooling today in 2012, I think, is largely due to, first, the fact that schools are not improving after all the much vaunted No Child Left Behind reforms, and you name it, it hasn't worked. In fact, it's amazing how when you hear about the things that do work, it's just, small classrooms, following child, using a child's interests, like playing games. The gamification of learning is a big topic right now. But all these things have been happening in homeschooling for 30 years. In fact, they've been happening in human nature forever. But it's only since we've walled them off and turned them into this, fractured sort of learning that, subject by subject that happens in school. And I think that that's the second thing is people, first of all, turned off by the standardized, education that is forced. I mean, literally force children to learn, not just through compulsory attendance, but by the elimination of recess. When I was in school, we had 2 recesses, morning and afternoon. Now there's none. We're seeing childhood obesity, all these problems, childhood diabetes. But what do? We put them into school even longer. Now we're saying they've got to be in, mandatory kindergarten, mandatory pre-K, and the pressure builds. And I think eventually what's happened is that people are worn out. It's like saying the sky is falling. I mean, how many times can you say, your child just needs more school in order to get ahead in the world, only to find out that we're in yet another jobless recovery, that, indeed there is one parent usually at home these days because of the economy, and the schools don't have the resources. I mean, they can't even let your kids play in the yard. Everything is geared towards the test. Right now I'm watching a wonderful TV series called The Wire. And it was done in 2005. The season I just saw was about education. And they were talking about the problems of teaching to the test and how it's ruining the classroom. These are people working with inner city kids, whose families are completely messed up in one way or another, under incredible pressure. And that was 7 years ago. And it's gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. So that's one of the pressures. Then the other thing is that people do realize, well, how do I learn? If you look at our lives, if you look at society, in the 1980s, I remember ATMs coming out and the Coleco TV home console and the Apple Macintosh computer. All these things came out and they got adopted by the culture and cell phones. And who used them first? The kids. Who showed us how to make them popular and use them? It was the kids. And they learn this stuff. We were talking about Sugata Mitri. People see that even poor street children in India can learn to use a computer on their own. Right. On their own. And in fact, we keep thinking that, now that we've got computers, we have to have technology courses. Instead of putting like Negroponte and these people at MIT want to just put a laptop in every kid's hands. That's a smart idea to me. That makes more sense than let's have one laptop and a teacher teach it to 30 kids at once. So I think that socially, society is also realizing that school isn't what it's cracked up to be. This isn't the way we learn, and that the way technology has changed. I mean, everything that I cited were changes in from the 80s. My gosh, right now, when I talk to homeschooling groups, I feel like a dinosaur. They say, how did you homeschool without the internet? Right? It's amazing, It's and technology keeps changing. The internet, it was Web 2.0 a few years ago. I'm sure someone's gonna coin 3.0 soon, Right. So, in fact, I bet you Lisa Nielsen is done, So, there's a lot of social pressure that I think people are feeling. Times are changing. Schools are not. The best that they have to offer is that they say, we're improving test scores. That's thin gruel, and especially as we're cutting and cutting and cutting and making kids do more and more work, that just seems like an empty ritual. Will I really become a doctor? What are the chances of anybody becoming a doctor or a lawyer or one of those super highly paid professionals, compared to the amount of graduates that are coming out that are aspiring to that? The whole system is just starting to fall apart from its own weight. However, I remember John Gatto telling me in 1991, the schools are going to implode in the next 10 years. I remember, I just saw a video on Thursday night of R. Buckminster Fuller talking at a TV show in 1979. In 10 years, there'll be major changes in society due to technology. My revolutionary fervor is considerably doused by these events, and also from my work with John Holt and Ilic, who didn't have a lot of patience for people who claimed radical ideas and revolutionary ideas, because they saw how quickly they burn out and how alienating they become, and they just become like the Shakers, a little movement that, because of its purity, eventually, they wouldn't allow people, the members of their sect, to have sex. So eventually, because of the purity of the movement, it just died out. And I'm worried sometimes that can happen with homeschooling and unschooling. But on the other hand, I think it's happening with schools. Right. Yes, I think that they're looking for alternatives, and I'm glad you picked that thread up, because I think there's another thread too, which is people are also looking for more meaning in their lives. And school has become the de facto religion for the proletariat, if you will, for the working class. It's our salvation. That's how we're going to get ahead. And now we don't see that anymore. We realize that, them that has gets, if you got the legacy to Yale, you got it. They're going to let a certain percentage of the proletariat in, so to speak. But, basically Yale or the Ivy Leagues, and again, it's not a conspiracy. I'm not trying to go down that thing. I mean, it's just the reality, that, the 1% protects itself. Always has, and if you look at it in our government, Harvard came out with this study that said that, and this is going back 3 or 4 years, that being a graduate of an Ivy League college did not make you a better employee compared to being a graduate from other colleges. So therefore, it's the brand. Why chase the brand name? If you go to University of Wisconsin and get an MBA, why must you get the Wharton School of Business? Well, it's the brand name. It's the conspicuous consumerism, and I think this has finally caught up to people because of the price. Right. Do you really want to pay? But now, unfortunately, state colleges are running down the same path of madness too. So everything is sort of bursting at the seams in terms of the education scene, and parents want to know, well, what can I give my child if the salvation of school is really just an empty promise? What is it? And then they realize me, my family, my community, and they start to dig deep, and then they start to realize that things like, well, maybe if I just grow some food on my back porch or my garden, I gain a little independence. Maybe if I could teach my child, how to build a birdhouse, we could do something to help me around the house. And then one thing leads to another, and you start to realize, gee, my kids are good at learning, and so am I, and I can adapt. And then I think that realization, slowly but surely, people come to the realization that they can do this too. And when school stops working for their child, then they may stop and think, well, just like I was able to plant a garden and grow, just as I was able to fix things around my house, I know how to read, write, and calculate. I could teach my child. And they do it, and as you know, more and more people are doing it, Ironically, I'm not sure that they're doing it for as long as they used to. I mean, the average length of time that people homeschool is 3 years, according to census data, So there's a lot of movement, going on, And I remember when I got started at Growing Without Schooling magazine in 1981. John had already published it for 4 years by then. And we were being looked at by a few researchers because we had people who've been doing it the longest amount of time. But even then, there have been people who were homeschooling or unschooling, whatever you want to call it. They didn't have the word back in 1977. We've been doing it for 20 years. Right. And through Growing Without Schooling, we found that. So, and I guess that's the other element is people. Back in 1981, I didn't know anyone who was homeschooling. It was such a foreign idea to me. And then when I met people through John at the office, and I started to realize that their kids are not socially retarded and completely inept in life, and that there really is something to this. In fact, one thing that I noticed then, and I've heard this for my 30 plus years in homeschooling, is teenage homeschoolers look adults in the eye. I mean, I've heard that a lot. I mean, it's an anecdotal comment. You're not, I mean, it's true. It's like, because they're used to being around it. Adults aren't like the big authority figure. Cheez-Its, the adults. Cheez-It, the cops. Run away. It's a different attitude all around. And I think that some families want to get that too. So they're seeing homeschoolers. They're seeing in their own lives that they could do some things on their own. And then they're realizing that school isn't the bill of goods that they were sold. So I think that all those factors contribute to the growth of homeschooling. Well, it was a very gradual process for me. I'd say it's one of the more atypical homeschooling stories. Because first of all, I got involved with John Holt in homeschooling as a single person. I was dating the woman who's now my wife. And she was a strong feminist involved in the theater. We met doing the theater, and homeschooling was nowhere. I didn't even know the word, but I just graduated graduate school. I had a master's in English, and I couldn't even get a teaching job because I didn't have a teaching certificate. And it was like, I didn't know I had to have that. I was like, I could do like John Holt and teach in private schools. But back then, they were letting teachers go. They passed a thing called the Property Tax Rollback Bill, Proposition 2.5 here in Massachusetts. So they were firing teachers. And so there were public school teachers with many more years' experience looking for work. I wound up running a cash register in a bookstore. That's a great use of my master's degree. So that was the beginning of my realization that maybe education is full of empty promises, And sure enough, as I was working there, I was getting fed up, chasing shoplifters, is basically it, and counting change. I couldn't believe how few people actually read books who worked in a bookstore. It's astounding. But anyway, one of the cashiers there who did read books, Cindy, she said that, if I wanted to at least move into the office work or something, and back then word processing was the big thing. And we're not talking about Microsoft Word. We're talking about a gigantic typewriter about this big that had a little teeny disk about that had maybe 10 pages of data on it, all text files. And John Holt had one at his office, and I could learn how to use a word processor in turn for typing up letters, correspondence. He had a lot of dictation. He was always on the road, and so he dictated a lot. And plus the magazine was growing, so they needed people to type up labels and whatnot. So I said, sure. So I volunteered. I worked with her husband, Tim, up there and learned how to do this in the evenings. John was not there. He was away in Scandinavia. I think it was a 6-week tour. So I met all the staff members there. And sure enough, and I eventually became trusted. They gave me the key. So sure enough, one night I was in there, and there was the man himself. There was John. He lived by himself down in Beacon Hill. So often he would come up and work in the office, catch up. He would read, I'm not kidding, like 3 or 4 books a night sometimes, And so he would always have like a stack of review books or books that he purchased that he wanted. And he'd just sit in the office and read them. So I came in, and there he was. We introduced ourselves, and we started talking. It turns out he was from New York. I love jazz. I love jazz. In fact, at the time, I was leaning very strongly towards becoming a full-time musician. And we were talking, and then so he asked me, "So what do you want to do with your life?" And so I told him the honest truth, which was I was thinking of being a teacher. And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because I like working with children." And he took his glasses off. He looked at me. He said, "Pat, if you become a teacher, you're not going to work with children. You're going to work on children." And I couldn't believe it. What are you saying? And before I could start my argument, she was like, "Have you read any of my books?" I said, "No." And he said, "Well, start. Any one of them. I mean, there's a theme in all my books, so it won't be hard." Because I'm not going to argue with you because I've heard all this in my time, So if you're reading the book, I'll talk about it. But otherwise, let's just talk about music instead. So we did. We talked about music, and it stuck in my mind. Like, what? What does he mean? So oddly enough, at that time, his book Teach Your Own had just come out in 1981, and one of my jobs was to unpack the hardcovers and put them on the shelves. So I figured, let me start with that one. I couldn't get into it. By the second chapter, I was pulling my hair out thinking, this guy's crazy. Who's going to teach her? This is nuts. And so I remember talking to Peg Durkee, his business manager at the time, and she said, well, why don't you start with his first book, How Children Fail? That's my favorite, and that might get you into it, because, I mean, this is something that has been so true of John and Yvonne. Ivan Ilic, and most of the people that I know through them, is their ideas changed over time. And so she said, if you get started where John got started as a 5th grade teacher with How Children Fail, it might make more sense where he wound up with Teach Your Own. I said, okay. So I read How Children Fail, and it made sense to me. I got it. And then I was able to engage John in all these conversations, and then we started to have open houses every Wednesday. One Wednesday, I forget what it was, one Wednesday a month. And this was just to get people from all across the country. Whoever was in Boston on that, they could come and meet John Holt. And if John wasn't there, if he was speaking, meet us. Just come down and find out homeschooling information. And we had, all sorts of people, professors from Boston University, apple pickers from, migrant folks coming down from New Hampshire and Vermont, ministers, you name it, super religious people, super pagan people, super unaffiliated people, I mean, just all coming in, all wanting the same information. How do I do this? Is it legal? That was the main question. Is it legal? And we had the information, and the fact is, homeschooling was legal, is legal, always has been. John knew this. There was a loophole that he, as he found out, he wrote a book called Instead of Education in 1976. I mean, when we talk about John, I'll outline more of this. But at the end of Instead of Education, John called for an underground railroad to get children away from the destructive effects of compulsory schooling. And with that last paragraph, he didn't realize he was starting Grown Without Schooling magazine, because within months of writing that, people said, oh, you don't need an underground railroad, John. You can teach them yourself. Now, I found in his files an article from the New York Times in 1971 about a family in Manhattan that taught their children. So this was on his radar. And in fact, in The Underachieving School, which he wrote in 1968, and What Do I Do Monday, which he wrote in 1970, he talks about parents should have the right to keep, to get their kids out of school altogether. But he never fully fleshed it out. It was always just a few sentences here and there, Now he realized, boy, people are doing this? Let me find out more about this. And as he found out more about it, he realized that, the Seventh-day Adventists living up in the mountains in Washington State didn't know the communards living in Ohio who were also homeschooling. And they were obviously doing it for very radically different reasons, but they were all homeschooling. So John acted as the lightning rod. And, one of the things that was really interesting to me is that he had this very strong liberal progressive background, which changed over time. He didn't become a conservative, but he realized that it's no use having just like in school. Only in school do we have dotted lines separating English from math from science. Why have religion or Montessori and Waldorf, all these different philosophies, separate learning? Why divide that up? So he didn't do any litmus tests. He talked to anybody and anything that could help further homeschooling. That's what he was interested in. And in fact, some of the very astute legal advice that was given during that time, John was filtered through John. Constitutional lawyers like William Ball and people at John Whitehead at the Rutherford Institute. John consulted with them, read their materials. And John's statement to the Minnesota legislature, and then again here in the Massachusetts legislature, I think were very important for outlining the legal case. And again, this is a guy who's not a lawyer. Right. He didn't study law in school. He didn't even study education in school. And this is his point, over and over again. It's never too late. You can always learn. I guess, once we got married and we started to talk about all these ideas and what it would mean, certainly for my wife, it was really important that she work. She got, still does, gets a lot of fulfillment out of that. And the whole feminist part of this puzzle really, didn't make a lot of sense to her. Although, I've met many feminist homeschoolers, unschoolers in particular, but for my wife, it was really just the idea. it was more about, she kind of got the idea about education and stuff. It was just more the practical, like, how do you make a living? How does it work? You know, and so we always had the kids in the office. She could see that. But she was doing slide production for a big company. Again, How the Mighty Have Fallen. At the time, it was Data General. They were the biggest computer company. There was this book, The Soul of a New Machine, written about them. You know, Tracy Kidder wrote it. Now they're gone. But at the time, you know, she had this big career with them, you know, as a producer for all their AV stuff. And it was so funny. So after, you know, John passed away when my wife was pregnant with our first child. And that was one of his regrets. He said, I wouldn't be able to see my children or Donna's children, who was the editor of GWS at the time. But then after our daughter was born, you know, we then, you know, had to deal with this two-income family, two different jobs scenario. And however, one of the first things that had to happen was, I think Lauren was only about 3 or 4 months old. She's still being breastfed, so we're keeping the breast pump going, you know. And my wife had a big show that she had to do, and she couldn't bring Lauren with her. And I was being interviewed by NBC TV at the office and on Boylston Street. So I had to bring Lauren in with me. And fortunately, there were a bunch of other employees that she was comfortable being around and stuff, but she was only like 3 or 4 months old, you know. So they're interviewing me similar to this, but I'm dressed in a suit, right? And I'm sitting behind my desk in the office. And Lauren was kicking up such a fuss. So bring her in. So the camera, everyone shuts down for a minute. I get Lauren settled on me, right? And she's down there. She starts to calm down. I give her a bottle with the breast milk in it, and she has a few sips. And we start up the interview again. She sits up and throws up all over me right on the camera. I was like, so this is the brave new world of homeschooling. But that was, again, par for the course. You know, we had to learn, you know, how to work with these things, and certainly, I mean, it's a difficult thing, you know, bringing children to work and making all that happen. And it took a few more years before my wife and I decided to work together and try to make it work at the Holt office. Well, first of all, it is defined in Webster's dictionary. I think it was 1549 is its first usage. It means untaught. You know? And the second meaning means a natural, like an unschooled musician, you know, natural talent. So, you know, there is a meaning there. So when people say, what do you mean by it? This relativism, you know, gets a little crazy, you know. And certainly John tried to define it. And if you read Teach Your Own, there's a chapter, The Politics of Unschooling. Before I go into Teach Your Own, in Growing Without Schooling, I think it was the second or third issue, he actually says, when we mean this, we will use the word unschooling. When we mean this, we'll use the word deschooling. And so let me back up. In 1971, Ivan Ilic came out with a book called Deschooling Society. This has been based on a series of essays and thoughts that he'd been having for many years. He wrote a thing in the New York Review called We Must Abolish Schools, where he really promoted this idea. John Holt grabbed on. He thought this was brilliant. And he went down to Mexico. He studied with Ilic. And unlike all the other progressives who pretty quickly gave up on Ilic, you know, because they said, oh, well, what about the poor? You know, to use one example, there are many other reasons why they didn't like these ideas. But John saw the value, the deep value in this, and really wanted to push it more. But one of the problems was the word deschooling. People got the idea that it meant like blowing up the schools, never using school again. And what Ivan meant is, if you read the book, disestablishing school by invalidating compulsory schooling laws. Just like we disestablished religion, saying you know only Christians could hold office. We disestablished that, but that didn't mean that there were no churches or religious organizations. Same thing would happen with schools. People don't trust that. They don't believe it. You know, so that was Ivan's first problem. Was he came up with this brilliant, nice, elegant solution, but by calling it deschooling, people couldn't get into it, couldn't even understand it. It just set up all these blocks. So John came up with, you know, in 1977, the word homeschooling wasn't popular, but it was out there a little bit. But he decided that, he wanted to come up with the word unschooling because the type of learning he was talking about didn't have to take place at home, and it didn't have to look like school.
Right.
And at the same time, there was an ad campaign by 7-Up. And they were saying, we're not a cola, we're more natural. We are the Uncola.
Right.
And I think he was kind of picking up on that, so he came up with the word unschooling. But so for many years, like throughout the 80s, I gave a workshop called Learning Without a Curriculum. That's how I would describe unschooling, plain and simple. And then in the 90s, the different people started to come up with their, like I think around 1991 was the first time I saw the phrase radical unschooling. And, there started to be these factions as unschooling got larger, we added a table of contents to Growing Without Schooling, and some people said we were getting too organized, getting too intellectual, getting too, you can't please everybody. And I know that, and I certainly made missteps at the company, but, adding a table of contents and being intellectual, I didn't think was one of them. But anyway, that was it. And then so they said unschooling means this, unschooling means that. And then, and people would really push me for, well, it just can't mean learning without a curriculum. And so then I would say it means allowing your children as much freedom to learn in the world as you can comfortably bear. Which to me, I thought about that for a while, trying to come up with something, because I really wanted to show the dynamic relationship between parent and child that's going on here, and that it is going to be different from family. Well, that definition has gotten me in more hot soup than anything, because a lot of people say, no, unschooling means letting your children watch TV and staying up all night, whatever they want to do is what unschooling is.
Right.
And that really puzzled me, because I can't tell you how many times we spent talking on talk shows and different Christian conferences and so on about unschooling does not mean unparenting.
But that's the thing. I think the terminology that we use to describe home education, like even the word, homeschooling doesn't make sense to me, because what we do looks nothing like school, and my kid's never home.
Yeah.
Right. So that doesn't make any sense. And then you try to explain to people that we sort of unschool, and I think a lot of people get the word school and the word education, they're the same. They're interchangeable. And so when you say unschool, it sounds like uneducated.
Exactly.
Right. So then the kids are just stupid. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
they don't get it. So you can't say homeschooling and you can't say unschooling to some people.
Right.
They don't. So what do we call it?
Right.
Like, how do we refer to it?
Well, I know, and it's a puzzle, and I'm afraid the word homeschooling is the default.
Yeah.
Because this is the point I make. And when I spoke to the radical unschoolers a couple of weeks ago up in New Hampshire, I really felt it resonated with them. Which is, you don't register, and you never ever have registered to unschool in any state or country. Period.
Right.
It's always homeschool.
Right.
So therefore, legally, it's homeschooling. And legally, if homeschooling is banned, unschooling is banned. You just can't get away from it. In Sweden, in Germany, Brazil, they've banned homeschooling. There goes unschooling. And that's what's sad to me, is because I know that there's plenty of school-at-home homeschoolers who would throw unschoolers under the bus because they don't like this idea, because they're very wedded to the idea of school. Again, to go back to earlier, it is their salvation. They honestly believe that following these steps will lead them to an educated individual, whereas the sort of peregrinations of an unschooler can't lead to anything but some gypsy. Although, of course, we know there are many, many examples and so on. But so they're very willing to throw us under the bus, the school bus, But the irony is, if homeschooling is banned, their type of homeschooling is banned too. It doesn't matter how loose or how tight you are. So I think one of the things we just have to do is bite the bullet and just say homeschooling is the phrase. That's what we have to work with. This is 20, 30 years of legal precedent using this term. Let's blow it out and make it work for us. Oh no, I think it's far worse. This is one of those points that again makes me realize that a lot of people like John Holt's ideas but don't know them. like I hear unschoolers in particular say, "Oh, there's no such thing as teaching. Teaching's a bad word. Teaching, home education. That's what." No, you read John Holt, read Ivan Ilic. In fact, I'd love to spend more time talking about this, but John prided himself in being a teacher. Prided himself on helping people learn, helping. He didn't like the word education. He wrote a book called Instead of Education. He did not like being called an educator. Ilic, back in the 70s, late 60s, was saying, education is poison. It's this idea that that's the religion, that's the process, that's it. When, people like Herb Cole, who's, a brilliant teacher, but he prides himself on being an educator. I mean, that to me is like that's where you remove yourself and become the expert that manipulates all the people below you, and that's the idea John wanted to get away from. It's just like, no, one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it. And yeah, I teach people how to play the piano. I love to do that. But, people come to me and I show them, and you know what, to find out where they are, I have to give them, quote, a test. I don't call it a test. I say, play something for me. But that's telling me where they're at and where I can then help them, So, I mean, we got hung up, but we have to look at the word education. This is really the problem. That people are ignoring in homeschooling, unschooling. We're so wrapped up in saying, "Oh, do you coerce your child? Oh, you wouldn't let them eat ice cream. That's you're coercing them into eating the way you want them to eat. Oh, you're coercing them to your bedtimes, or forcing them. If you feel that you can unschool your child in everything but math. I met more families this way than I can remember. But but math is the one thing that they can't do on their own, right? Okay, fine. If that makes you feel good, good, because I don't have the magic method that's going to get you and your family happy with homeschooling or unschooling. I'm trusting you to become the expert on your family and your child and yourself. So I'm trusting you. And so everyone is going to be different. So this idea that, everyone's got to unschool the same way or their unschooling has to look the same is very, very foreign to me, because that to me is education. Right. Education goes back to John Amos Comenius, this guy. He's called the father of education, I think, in the Middle Ages, and he came up with the phrase, I can't say it in Latin, but it's to teach everybody everything perfectly. That was his goal. And we've seen that in how education is now drawn for us in the 21st century and throughout the 20th century. They say it comes from the Latin word educere, which means to draw forth, to draw out. And that's what a teacher does. I take this raw material, this lead out of this child, and I draw forth their talent and I create gold with this. What nonsense. Because, as Ivan Ilic pointed out to me, and he writes about this beautifully in a couple, and he says it eloquently in his last book, The Rivers North of the Future, The Testament of Ivan Ilic, which is a book of conversations. Educere means to draw forth, yes. But what it means specifically is it's a nurturing term. It means to draw forth mother's milk. It's who's drawing forth? The child is drawing forth. And that's why Ivan points out, if you look at the iconography of the church, I forget the name of the bishop, but being a historian, he nails it. But this one bishop decided that the milk of knowledge that comes forth from the church is best represented by having men have breasts. So you can see statues of this bishop with breasts, women's breasts, because that's the milk of knowledge coming forth from the. And Ivan goes one step further, because not only do he say, so this is this idea of education has gotten transferred from the active learner getting nurtured from a mother to an institution, spitting out the milk of wisdom as it sees fit. All of a sudden, the mother-child relationship, this nurture, becomes an institution. Ivan takes us further as he studies the church in its history. It's trying to point out that, we used to take care of each other in communities. The early church had this saying that you always keep a candle and a mat in your home for some stranger who would knock on the door. So they, you're welcome. Have hospitality. This is very important in the early church. Then Ivan noted that something happened in the middle. The church changed. The church said, "Oh, you individuals don't have to take care of the strangers. We'll take care of them. Just give us the money to create this place." And they did. And that became, as Ivan points out, that all of a sudden it became disembedded from the community and from the family into this institutional process. And he sees the roots of education right there. As we go from taking care of one another in a family and communal situation to an institution. And he just traces this down through the centuries until we got to, as he calls it, this mad religion of education. Because as the institution of the church has lost more and more of its legitimacy over time, and I think in the 21st century we're seeing this happen very rapidly, something else had to come up. And in deschooling society, Ilic wrote this beautiful phrase. He says, schools, education in schools how does he put it? Man suffers from pedagogical hubris. That man can do what God cannot, namely manipulate another person for their own salvation. Even God can't do that to you. You have to choose it, but we don't allow that. And he saw this. He came at it from this very unique perspective. And then John did. But John was a teacher. He was very wedded to this idea of education. He was a tough teacher. He often bragged about it, But he changed over time. And by the time he had written 3 books, by the time he met Ilic, the third book, the title says it all, The Underachieving School. And John was really sort of beginning to say, this school business isn't really working, and I don't know what else there is. And Ilic was saying, unlike John's colleagues, Jonathan Kozol, Herb Cole, George Dennison, and so on, Ilic, the reason it doesn't work is because it was never intended to work. The whole institution is set up to preserve the institution, and that becomes the important thing, not so education and the process of education is more important than individual teaching and learning. Well, one of the things that strikes me about all this is the Back to the Future elements. None of this is new. I remember in 1981 or 82, there's a report that came out. I can't remember the name of it, but it was under the Reagan administration.
It's called A Nation at Risk.
That was it. Thank you. A Nation at Risk. And John Holt was on the radio, and he wrote in USA Today, and a bunch of op-eds. He was all asking his opinion. And he was like, this is like Sputnik in the 50s. This is not new. We had the same sort of scare then, And here we are again. Instead of chasing the Russians with Sputnik or, back to the basics because the progressive education of the 70s had ruined things, although look at the economy of the 80s and how all the innovations. This disconnect between the schools and reality and life is remarkable to me. But I'm sorry, I'm losing my thread there. So to me, No Child Left Behind is just more this same old crap. It never changes. So what if the test scores improve? Doesn't mean anyone's learned anything. Right. That was John's point when he wrote How Children Fail in 1964. He was writing about working in private schools with the best and the brightest. He never worked in a public school. And in those schools, he wrote, the only difference between a good student and a bad student is the good student is very careful not to forget what they studied until after the test is taken. And this is true. I mean, look at us. We're required to have, I think, 5 years of foreign language if you go to a public school. And if you go to a private school, the same thing. They'll make you take foreign languages. None of us. We're the most monolingual country on earth, despite all that. What an empty ritual. What a waste of our time. And then when I present this to teachers, when I actually say it and they nod their heads, as everyone in this room is doing, as we all know what nonsense this is, right? They say, well, that's because they don't use it. I was like, thank you. Well, so when you need it, you can learn it, and the best way to learn it is in a situation where there's a need. So why do we persist? Why do we persist? Again, because of the testing. Right now, one of I'm kind of jumping ahead, so I guess maybe we could do some editing, but it seems appropriate to make this remark here. I've been pleased to find a group of people that support these ideas and work, and we get together every 3 or 4 months to talk about what's going on, and so one of them is this professor at Boston College. I guess he's retired now, Peter Gray, and another one's Kirsten Olsen, who wrote a book called Wounded by School. And we are interested, with some other colleagues, in finding out how, the words unschooling, homeschooling, Sudbury Valley, which is Peter's big thing, they don't grab people, but the situation's getting worse. No Child Left Behind, and this whole testing mania has gotten so bad that schools don't allow recess. We talked about that because it interferes with learning time. All right? So we found out about a place called Playworks. It started in California, and now they're here in Massachusetts, and they're trying to bring 15 minutes of recess, 15 minutes back to the day, to these children. And the only way they could do it is by promoting it as structured play. They're going to have a coach in the playground. And what makes them sell it to the schools is that studies show that you get 2.5 minutes or less time having the kids calm down, so you reclaim learning time. This is crazy. I mean, this whole idea that, learning, that right now you can tell me that I'm ready to learn and I'm going to learn in the next, I'm going to get 5 minutes of learning in. But this is the whole school model. Everyone has bought into this, and, it's a shame that teachers' unions have not acted like professional organizations, but I guess they never have. They've just rolled over and done whatever the politicians and the administrators say. I can't imagine doctors and lawyers. I like to think they're more independent, but even them, I don't know. I mean, there seems to this lack of spine, and maybe it's because no one really knows what to do. But again, there are so many alternatives out there. I mean, I'm not just talking about homeschooling. Waldorf, democratic schools, independent Christian schools. There's so many models out there. And if you look through the literature, my gosh, I could show you my office. Just 10 books about different types of schools right there. If you want the school model, and John Holt was often talking about. And this is one of the things that we were talking about earlier too, like places like the village schools or not Sudbury Valley, that is a school, but North Star or Purple, like these transitional learning centers. I mean, there are a lot of these models out there, but we're just completely trapped in this idea that it has to be time on task. That children only learn if they're taught. And John Holt has this radical idea that learning is not the result of teaching. Learning is the result of the activity of learners. And that really pisses educators off. Because education only works if you're instructed. And let me add, John Holt did say, and Ivan Ilic too, teaching of course works. And they were proud to call themselves teachers. But it's like medicine. It only works when it's given at the right dose, at the right time, for the right illness. Otherwise, it becomes a poison. A poison to a child's curiosity. Right. And as Eva pointed out, when I become a teacher, I'm in an unequal relationship with you. Mm-hmm. I'm your superior. This is a very dangerous relationship. This should be respected. This should be a very rare relationship. So for Ivan, it was definitely this master-pupil thing, but very rare. He preferred social discourse. That's why when he would give lectures and people would say, well, what should I do? He would say, I'm not your teacher. Sit down. I'm just here to talk with you. There's a big difference, The way our children, we allowed our children to move in and out of school. We always felt that there was a swinging door between the home and the school because we had seen many parents have a very adversarial relationship with the school and paint the school and the children in the school as either losers or dangerous and that never felt right to me, and I know it didn't feel right with John Holt. I mean, again, when people say, oh, you shouldn't have a workbook, look at the books John Holt chose to sell in the catalog. Mathematics, A Human Endeavor. You know, Mrs. Stewart piano lessons. Are these not curricula? Of course they are. You know, but when you choose to use them, you know, I mean, there aren't many textbooks that John Holt liked. You know, there are very few, but they're there, and he sold them. And he worked with people in schools. He was always willing to talk to people, but you know, his ideas had changed, you know, and so he was, you know, but he didn't want them to go. And I think I picked up on that very strongly, because, I mean, frankly, one of the reasons my wife agreed to homeschool is because, you know, she didn't feel that I was a zealot, that, you know, oh, you know, keep them out, oh, those evil schools, you know. I realized that, you know, and John, towards the end of his life, got stronger about that. You're better off, I mean, I remember him telling me, you're better off not sending them at all, you know. But he also understood that children have pressures too. My children, if I lived in an area where there was nothing but homeschoolers around me, that would be pretty easy to homeschool straight through. We're the only homeschooling family on the street. In fact, we're probably the only homeschooling family in about a mile radius here, you know. Although I take that back. Now, in 2012, I do know there are 2 homeschooling families living within walking distance of my house now. But, you know, when we moved here in 1991, it certainly wasn't the case. I mean, back then, Diane Flynn Keith, who you interviewed, car schooling. I spent a lot of time car schooling in those years, you know. But my girls played with kids in. And one of the reasons we chose this neighborhood was because when we were driving around, first they had a very bad school district, so the property prices were low. We could afford to live here. We knew we weren't going to send our kids to the school. And unfortunately, when they chose to go, that became yet an issue. But, you know, I mean, I'll be happy to talk about that. But that was one of the things. We saw lots of children, you know. And that's what we wanted, you know. Kids riding bikes. There's a playground just down the street from us. We had a nice backyard. It had a jungle gym in it. You know, when we moved in here, it was already there, and so we had all the. This was it. You know, I mean, when people talk to me about, you know, homeschooling and how isolating it is, it's like, you know. We took the complete opposite tack. You know, we found it was easier. And again, maybe it's because of my experience working at Holt, you know, as a single guy, and then as a married guy bringing his kids in. I realized that you can actually get more done if you have kids around and the kids are playing with each other. Mm-hmm. So you get your time to do your thing. And it, you know, I mean, I'm just not hung up on like always watching my kids, because I know they're not going to get hurt. You know, I mean, like I'm aware of the dangers. I make it safe for them. And then that's it. Trust them. You know, and that worked out. That's worked out fine for us. You know, but we wanted this neighborhood because, you know, the kids could be here and that we could work, and it worked out, you know, fantastically for us. I kind of lost the thread of where I was going with all that.
I was just asking about how was it transitioning them in and out of.
Oh, okay. And so my kids, by being exposed to a lot of kids who then had to go to school. And by the way, the local grammar school was this building right across the street from me. I mean, walking distance. You know? And so when my daughters wanted to go to school, first my oldest daughter, our neighbors here, they do not homeschool. They moved in the same, like a week before we did, and their 2 children are the same age as my 2 oldest children, so they became best friends. So when Heather went to school and Lauren didn't, there was a little weirdness, but they got over it. But in 6th grade, as my daughter approached 6th grade, my oldest, she wanted to go. Okay, so we believe in giving children choices. You know, if they don't want to learn math, we say fine. If they want to go to school, we say why. If it was to ride the school bus, we're like, sure, we'll let you ride the school bus, but you don't have to go to school. You know, we can figure out ways to do this. Oh, you could be friends with Heather and she doesn't go to school, right? But then when it became things like, I want to go to school to do science projects in a classroom, you know, and they present, it's kind of like, you know, when they wanted a dog and I didn't want one, it's like, oh, but, and they met every objection I had, and eventually we got the dog. You know, Lauren had all these reasons, and I was like, okay, you could try, but just remember, it's a swinging door. If it doesn't work, you come out. So around Thanksgiving, she wanted to come out. And then all of a sudden, the big science project happened. And they said, you and Heather got to choose what they were going to do, and they were going to start, and it was going to be the whole second semester project. So she decided that she wouldn't come out around Christmas. Okay, so she gets in, she goes into school, and then it happens. Yeah, she could do a science project, but she had to choose from this list of 3 or 6, I forget what it was, but not the project that she and Heather wanted to do. It involved something to do with astronomy, as I remember it, and said they had to do something with hydroponics. Big disappointment, and and because she made this promise to Heather, she felt she wanted to stay, and so she stayed through the year, and that was it. And then what a lie school was, she felt. Never went back until she went to college, homeschooled right through high school. My middle daughter, and so Lauren's transition was, we prepared her, what school was going to be like. She did it, and she made I'm sorry. It's funny, because she's 26 now. But I just remembered the main reason why she wanted to do it. She wanted to make the honor roll. I think this is really an important thing that unschoolers and homeschoolers, maybe not so much homeschoolers, but unschoolers tend to overlook. Lauren was always wondering where she stood in the pecking order, because we weren't giving her tests. She wasn't using the same books that they were using. We could tell her, oh, you know more about this, than them. But they were like, yeah, but they all know how to do fractions, and So she wanted to know how smart she was in comparison to her friends who went to school. And the only way she could do it, having mom and dad tell her, wasn't enough. Right. She had to prove it to herself. That's how she did it. She made the honor roll in 6th grade. She didn't get to do her project, but she did do a science project, and so she's got a good taste of school, and she was like, I'm done. Enough of school. So that was her. And then my middle daughter, Allison, she just, her best friend, her dearest friend, was in school, and I think that she really wanted to do it. And in fact, she's here. I don't know if you'll have time to interview her, but you could speak directly with her, probably better. But she really wanted to go to school. But we felt that the local school, the private school here, she would actually have to go to the middle school, which is a bus ride away. We had a lot of misgivings about that, and so on. So we found an alternative school, which we drove her to, and she really enjoyed it. And she was sort of a star in the school. It was a very small alternative school in Wakefield. Worked out very well for her. But then she wanted to go to high school, so she did, and that was when she hated school, and she couldn't wait to get done with school. And to this day, it cracks me up how she says her favorite time was homeschooling. So I was like, I know, go figure. And then our youngest, she's the one that's been in and out of school the most, because she is the most sociable of them. For instance, Lauren learned to read exactly like they do in school. My wife and I read a lot to her at night, but my wife would sit there sometimes and make flashcards, with the word push, then put ED, and not even flashcards, or Post-it notes, show the different tenses and stuff. So sort of like by 10 years old, 3rd grade age, she was reading. It was great, But my middle daughter, she had meningitis as a baby, so she had a speech issue. So phonics, she had a hard time forming words. So phonics was a bust for her, but the whole language worked great. And what worked best for her was the video game, The Legend of Zelda. We got the first Nintendo when it came out, and they just fell in love, as did I. So I had no problem playing the game with her. But it was all reading. It was one of those adventure games, so you really had to read a lot. And eventually, I was like, as I got pretty far ahead of the game, I was like, Allison, I can't constantly read this stuff. So she eventually figured out how to do a lot of this reading from The Legend of Zelda, and wanting to get through. And of course, she finished the game before I did. She got through it. And so, she kind of learned to read at a slightly later age, slower, but now she's an avid reader, just, she's in the middle of the Hunger Games now and stuff like that, she loves to read for pleasure. And then our youngest, she was 5, she was reading. We have no idea how she taught herself. She was just one of those kids. Yeah, we read to her a lot, but we don't ever remember sitting down. So each child was different, And so we got that experience realizing that they really do learn on their own. And Audrey's always been sort of a go-getter that way on her own, So when she, there was a lot, when she was 5 or 6, there was a lot of tension because Holt Associates, it was the last like 5 or 6 years, it was very difficult running a company that's slowly going down. The internet was eating our business, and I didn't understand the internet. It was 1998, 99, Amazon, all of a sudden, like we'd started this publishing company that was doing great, and then all of a sudden it stopped doing great, It was independent bookstores were going out of business. Amazon was just eating everybody's lunch, and one bookstore after another that used to sell our sorts of books was just going under. So I was struggling trying to figure out what to do, and there was a lot of tension in the family. And I think Audrey just decided it would be easier if she went to school. So she decides she wants to go to first grade, which is a school right over here. So she goes into first grade, and after 2 weeks, we get this phone call from the principal. The principal says, "Got to talk to you." "Okay, what?" "I think your daughter would prefer to be homeschooled." This is the principal at school talking to us. It's like, why? What are you talking about? Well, the teacher and I, her name is Miss Rapucci, she was a wonderful teacher, realized that she already knows her ABCs. She already knows basic addition and subtraction and all this stuff. And, there's 30 kids in this class, and half of them don't, and, there's a lot of time. And she's really bored with stuff, and, and we realize that this is going to be an issue for her. We could see it. So, she said that, she wanted to come to school, but now she's changed her mind if we would ask you. For her, okay, no problem. So she came home. And so we had this wonderful relationship with the school. My daughter Allison, when she was in 5th grade or 4th grade, she wanted to learn Spanish. Right. So we talked to the local school, and they said, sure. These one-on-one relationships. And again, by not demonizing the school, our children didn't have this idea that they were demons, nor did the school feel that we were a bunch of losers, untaught. Like, oh, you want your child to learn Spanish? Well, we teach Spanish to 4th graders at the Swan School, which is one of the schools down this way. But, again, she could take a bus or walk, or we could drive her. It wasn't that far. And she would sign at the principal's office, take her Spanish class, sign out, and come home. Well, right now I'm involved in a project called the Celebration of John Holt. And I've asked a number of people who knew John, who were taught by John, or who were somehow touched by him, to write about their experiences with him. And as a result of going through my old files and talking to these people, I really have a very strong idea of John right now. Mm-hmm. And what always gets me about him was that he was a seeker. He was always open, always open. His ideas, while he had some core convictions, he was always open to change. What's the phrase I'm looking for? Always willing, like if he hears a knock at the door, to open it and see who's there. What I knew about John when I first met him was scant. I just knew he was a famous author. That was it, And then when I came to the office, most of the people who were working there, well, not two of them, Peggy and Jim Hayes, had been with John through the 60s and 70s. And so they remembered him as a sort of firebrand figure. I mean, I can't emphasize, it's hard for us now in 2012, with reality TV and all this stuff, to remember back like what it was like to be popular in the 60s without the internet and so on, and cable. But John was, quite popular for about 10 years. So much so that Look magazine, which was one of the biggest magazines at the time, he was their book reviewer. He wrote frequently for all the major publications. And he was a guest on a lot of talk shows. Probably a real telling moment is there was a TV game show called To Tell the Truth. There's a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, Catch Me If You Can, and this movie opens with that character being on To Tell the Truth, where three people pretend to be John Holt, and then the celebrity panelists guess, and the finale is the famous line, "Will the real John Holt please stand up?" And then that's who he was. So he had this idea, and he writes about this in his letters, that things were changing, that people were behind him, that this was hey, people are really interested in all these ideas. And then he kind of got the realization towards the particularly as the anti-war movement heated up, and he was very supportful of the students in the anti-war movement, and getting very disturbed with the way the universities, particularly, he was at the University of California in Santa Barbara, when they called out the police, and I think it was Ronald Reagan was governor at the time, and they incarcerated like thousands of these students, and really, it was a really botched setup, and a lot of kids got hurt, and a lot of tear gas and clubbing and so on that was completely unnecessary. And that was when John, I forget the name of his essay, but it got widely distributed, and also he got soundly put down for siding with the students. And he was kind of surprised at how many of the radical faculty supported this, and then even the faculty that was marching with the students, they eventually, like within the next year, became tenured or something. So John just started to realize, maybe this isn't exactly what I thought it should be. That maybe the system doesn't want to change. When he saw it at that high level, he talks about how he thought colleges were like, it was elementary and high schools that were messed up, but but then he changed his ideas about college, and then that's when he hooked up with Ivan Ilic, and then he realized, because Ivan was very critical, saying, the whole lower schools are just preparation for this, and so the head, things rot from the head, so this is if you can't change this, what does it matter if you change all that? You could have the most free schools on earth, but they're still gonna make you take the SAT and fit certain molds and so on. You're gonna do it, and that kind of opened John's eyes. And he realized that even as I said earlier, he called universities the chief enslaving institutions in America. So he really flipped around. So that was his first change. Going from like the celebrity school teacher who had these ideas about how to help children learn by working with children, and getting a lot of traction on that. But then he realized that, and then he started to look at alternative schools and so on, and teach at the university level. And then he realized that they were very good at taking these ideas of how to help children learn, but they really didn't want to do it to help children learn. They wanted to help them pass tests. And that really started to rub John wrong way. Really started to realize that something was wrong. There's a great quote. Excuse me. Yeah. I got this right. I bought. You asked me for some of these materials, and one of the things that really caught me is I'm working on this book, and Ivan Ilic had this quote from 1969 that could have been. This could have been written by John Holt, and I just want to get it right. Here it is. This was just a comment that Ilic made during a question and answer period.
Can you sit back?
Yes, absolutely. Ilic writes. He said, in fact, healthy students often redouble their resistance to teaching as they find themselves more comprehensively manipulated. This resistance is not due to the authoritarian style of a public school or the seductive style of some free schools, but the fundamental approach common to all schools, the idea that one person's judgment should determine what and when another person must learn. This idea really, grabbed John, this idea of sitting in judgment. Was he didn't like that at all. That's one of the reasons he didn't feel that he needed tests to help children learn. He proved it in his own experience, And instead of education, he writes about how he helped children, their grades actually improved when he was bringing typewriters and bugles and letting kids do things in the classroom and have noise and so on. Who didn't like it? Other teachers. And the parents. Parents complained, saying their kids are having too much fun. I actually told them that during parent-teacher meetings. And so he realized that, these ideas, still have a long way to go to convince people. But then, what is it, So he thought maybe free schools were the answer, but he, like Ivan, he saw pretty quickly that, as Ivan called it the seductive style of free schools, what John called it was the soft jail versus the hard jail. In either case, you're still, you're still being worked on, and it's like, so how do we get around that? How do we get away from that? So John went down and he started studying with Ivan, and just their views on teaching, which is what I'm focusing on in this manuscript here. They both changed their ideas so much over time. It's utterly fascinating to me how John was deeply influenced by Ivan, and Ivan recognized John's points and how it helped him further his thinking. But they both came to very different places on this, as they went on. But John was, by now in the 60s, he realized that standing on soapboxes, giving speeches and so on, wasn't going to change the schools. What was it? So I'm kind of leaping ahead, because he wrote a book called, at this time, called What Do I Do Monday? Which he thought would be the one book that would be the most popular among homeschoolers that he wrote. Turns out it isn't. But, because it told teachers, what do you do instead of this? Here's ideas for math, right? All it's like a little recipe book. The first half, though, the first half of the book outlines the rationale of why things aren't working in school, and then the second part is giving ideas. So therefore, if this is, here's how to do it. So always is very practical ideas. John never, Ivan could be very theoretical. In fact, John, in one of his letters to Ivan, John says, I view you as the prophet and strategist, and me as the tactician. John very much saw himself as down in the trenches working, and he loved that, and that's, let me step back and also, show you that John Holt is a person. He was shaped, I think, a lot by World War II. He served on a submarine, and he called it the best learning community that he'd ever been in. He has an essay that I've got online. It could be called The Learning Society. It was, I forgot what magazine it was published in. But he describes how the submarine was a great model for a learning society. But after that, after serving in the Navy, he was very disturbed by the prospect of nuclear arms. And so he joined the World Federalists, which was trying to control nuclear power through a one-world government. John rose through the ranks, became executive director for New York State, gave a lot of speeches about it, but eventually he decided that just as Ivan looked at the Catholic Church and saw how it became less concerned about dealing with people as it was with preserving its own institution, John felt that they kind of lost sight of their goal of preventing nuclear warfare, and instead became a group more concerned about perpetuating itself. So he left that. And so I think that these experiences shape both men about the value of working within the system to change it, and both saw that systems don't change that way. Systems change you.
Right.
He decided Well, so he wrote What Do I Do Monday, and that sort of like was the last book that I wrote specifically about schools and how to make them better. Then he wrote a book called Freedom and Beyond, where he talked about alternative schools and said, well, yeah, they're okay, but, they're not the be-all and end-all because the kids still have to go to them. And we're not reintegrating children. We're still creating these special places. And every one of these alternative schools has their own unique ideas about how children learn. Waldorf schools, you don't teach them to read till the eye teeth fall out, blah, blah, blah. So there's still like these what's the word I'm looking for? Preconceptions, about what like these theories of how children are supposed to grow instead of plant the seed and nurture it and see what happens. As John said, we're always in school ripping the plant up to look at the roots to see how it grows. Nothing could be more damaging. So he had a different conception about this. And so after Freedom and Beyond, he wrote. Actually, I think I got the order messed up, but he realized that adults weren't, and teachers, because of a variety of things, which I'd like to talk about at some point, are hemmed in to making change. And he saw that they wouldn't. So he thought maybe if we could approach this from a sort of constitutional, legal background. So he wrote a book called Escape from Childhood, The Needs and Rights of Children, thinking that if we could give children rights, then we could really help reintegrate them into society. This could be the way of getting around, because since no one wants to change the compulsory school laws, this is sort of an end run around this. Well, no book of his has generated more controversy and anger than that one. The idea of giving children rights. For instance, the right to choose their own guardian, right, or the right to control their own learning. These ideas, in fact, as John saved most of his book reviews, and when you look at some of these reviews, they're scathing, the New York Times was pretty favorable to it, but other than that, everyone, there was sort of like a turning point for John too, when he realized, whoa, I kind of got ahead of where people are at on these issues, because they just couldn't believe it. But the irony to me is, again, just like with Ivan, as much as they were done, I mean, when Ivan was proposed, he actually used the word learning web in deschooling society and learning exchanges. These are the ways. What's the internet? But that, right? He saw that coming. He was using file cards and telephones, in his model. But he saw how all this was going to go. Same thing with John. The right to choose your own legal guardian. There was a case in Florida about 10 years ago where a court allowed a boy to divorce his parents and choose a new guardian. The right to control one's learning. Well, I don't know. I mean, that seems even more of a radical idea. But these ideas are out there and are worthy of consideration. But of John's 10 books, Escape from Childhood is the only book I can't get a publisher interested in. I've published it myself 3 times. In fact, I'll probably do it a 4th time myself. Now that I could, use print on demand. So John was always looking for ways. How can I help these? How can I help children? How can I help them find a good place in society that doesn't involve them always being the pupil? And then he wrote Instead of Education, Ways to Help People Do Things Better as a subtitle. And as I said earlier, he had this not postscript, but he called for an underground railroad to get kids out. Mm-hmm. And then they said, no, you could do this. You could homeschool your child. And he said, well, tell me more. And once you realized that these parents from all around the country were doing it but not in touch with one another, you started Growing Without Schooling magazine. Instead of Education came out in 1976. GWS got first issue was August 1977. And in it, John talks about having mixed allies. So again, when I hear unschoolers won't talk to anyone if they use a workbook, it's like, I want to grow the movement. I want to become the Shakers. I want to grow the movement. I want to find as many nodes of getting people into it as possible. As I am convinced, I've seen this in my own life, I've seen this in so many people's lives. I don't care how you get started, but once you get started with homeschooling, you can't do school at home all day. It wears you out. You start to seek other answers. And eventually you find unschooling. Okay, you don't like that word, so you call it eclectic. You don't like that word. You say, well, call it whatever. You know what we used to tell parents? Call it the Farenga school. Call it the Stewart school. Call it Rory's school. Whatever. Just the name doesn't matter. And so John saw this, and he hit a nerve. Again, no one knew that all these people were out there. And there weren't. In fact, in 1981, when I got started, John said that he estimated there were maybe 20 to 25,000 children being taught at home then. Researchers who have studied the numbers say that's probably a fair estimate of the time, because 20 to 25,000 children. So if you have 3 kids per family, what's that? Maybe 9,000 families, something like that. So it was pretty slim pickings, And when we had we also had subscribers internationally, So there weren't a whole lot of homeschoolers back then, but they were finding us. And like I said, they would drive down to come to these meetings, at the Holt office, just because there was no other info. And then, of course, Growing Without Schooling being the first. Just love that title. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall. John Holt was like a master of 3-word titles. But what happens? Well, the Christian wing gets stronger, and they don't like Growing Without Schooling. So the main publication to come out of them became The Teaching Home, which came up. There's a dichotomy. You could see it right there. It was beautiful. But again, things are not as black and white. One of the great figures in homeschooling that I feel, sort of gets lost in the shuffle is Dr. Raymond Moore and his wife Dorothy. He was into Better Late Than Never was the name of one of his books. It was into delayed entrance for children. And he was writing about this in the early 70s. And when he was interviewed in Harper's Magazine about this, John Holt wrote in saying, "You don't go far enough." And that's how he and Ray Moore hooked up. And Ray wasn't like completely into homeschooling at all. John introduced him, but once he did, Ray got with it. He got it 100%. He was into delayed academics, but again, he had a very good, gentle way of dealing with it. And of all the Christians, he was always the one that said, everyone, I don't care if you're an atheist, Seventh-day Adventist as Ray was, an evangelical, it doesn't matter. We're all in this together. And he was always, even after John passed away, he was always very inviting to me, always kept me up to date. I always felt, that was an important thing, a very important relationship. And that's one of the things that I learned from John. He saw that he got ahead of people with Escape from Childhood. He saw that. But then he saw that, if the parents are involved, then you can get the children out of school. And then, those parents could use other adults. So he was, if you read John, he was a very smart politically guy. Politically, he was very smart. And again, he was an organizer from the World Federalists. And he saw the 60s firsthand with the student riots and the anti-war movements. He saw that if you can't multiply, if you can't replicate something, it's not going to grow as a movement. And that was a big problem that he saw in alternative schools and was writing about in Freedom and Beyond, was that they couldn't replicate themselves easily. That Summerhill worked because of A.S. Neal, But, it's been struggling. Neal passed away, his daughter took over, but, there aren't a lot of Summerhill schools. Sudbury Valley's been trying, to replicate themselves, but even that's, and Jerry Mintz and Nero with the whole democratic school movement, this is an issue. The Albany Free Schools, my friend Chris Macaliano, he's written a wonderful book about, how to start a school, It's really hard. And John knew that. And he says, it's going to be a lot easier to replicate a movement that helps children learn and grow in society the way we're talking about by just staying away from school. School just exactly, just avoid that. And in fact, in Teach Your Own, he talks about this, and this is something that we've practiced, in my family all the time. Clubs. Don't talk about clubs. We have a language club. I ran the Stage and Parlor Magic Club for 3 years here. I loved it. One of the great joys of my life. My youngest daughter I didn't even tell you all of the peregrinations. She went into first grade for a couple of weeks, and she did third grade for 5 weeks, then she did fifth grade for 2 months. She was always in and out, you know. But when she came out of fifth grade, she said, "That's it, Dad, let's homeschool." My wife was getting her master's in education at the time because we needed a full-time income. I was still, I was closing down Holt Associates and doing a part-time thing, so I was like, sure, I'll do the homeschooling. And it was one of the great pleasures of my life. Those 3 years were just, we had 20 homeschoolers come in here once a month for a 3-hour session. We did stage and parlor magic at this table over there in my backyard. Then we'd go out in old folks' homes and stuff, do all sorts of magic shows and performances for homeschoolers fairs. Great thing, but it was a club, And I had a couple of parents, pull their kids out because it wasn't rigorous enough. There was too much fun going on. They weren't learning. I mean, I was here for 3 hours with the kids. We had a blast. I'll take it, for what it was. I think they thought he was some sort of nut job as when he got started with How Children Fail, Learn, and Underachieve in School. He was very much, he taught it. He was asked to teach at Harvard. He taught at USC, Berkeley, UCal Berkeley. So he was in there. But once he started to criticize college in particular, that was where he started to get in trouble. And then as he got more radical and just saying that, you really don't need school. The more he hung out with Ivan Ilic and realized that, if you go to these poor countries, these Latin America, this is where Ilic's ideas were coming from, these children are learning just fine without school. They need things other than education. They need clean water. They need this. They will learn how to read and write. Why give them, build them a school? This is like what happened recently in Afghanistan with the 3 cups of tea. Why build schools when they need clean water? But we think that, education is a scarce commodity, and unless we have this education, they'll never have
So his ideas were sort of, people started to kind of frown upon him a little bit.
Yeah, because the education is like the crown jewel of industrial society. It's the apogee of a technological society. In fact, that's one of the things I learned from Ivan Ilic. This Frenchman, Jacques Ellul, wrote a book called The Technological Society in the late 50s. And in it, he identifies schooling as a technology that is changing society. He saw that schools are like these giant machines, and we view it that way. When I hear people say, we need more scientists, with STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Pull the lever, crank them out, all right? Well, guess what? By then, computers will be touchscreens will be so easy to use, we'll probably just talk to them, and whatnot. We're always behind the scenes, and John saw that. People don't want to accept that. We're still completely locked into this. Pull the lever, let the masters of the universe pull the lever, and we'll create more engineers because we see it coming. But it's never been that way. We don't see these innovations coming. We wish we could. And so John got more and more. You could look at his. It's funny. I became his business manager. I could look at his income from speaking engagements, way down by 1981 from the universities and think tanks and stuff, way down. But all of a sudden, Washington Homeschool Association started to talk to parent groups, being flown out to talk. And where did John talk? He wasn't talking at universities. He was talking on beaches. He was talking in state parks. He was going and staying at people's homes. In fact, he preferred that I book him to stay at someone's home rather than a hotel, because he liked to be around the families, wanted to be around the kids so he could watch things, So it didn't bother him because I think, again, given his background as an organizer from way back when, he knew that this is how it got started.
Right.
This is how you do it, He didn't get comfy in his little ivory tower and say, I'm going to have 500 people show up at the Asquith Hall at Harvard to hear me give my very polished presentation. In fact, he sat in a beach chair and and just to answer questions as people talk to him for hours on the beach.
So much more of a grassroots type approach and kind of, individual family kind of.
Absolutely. And he really, that was one of the things about John that he really enjoyed, is that if he felt he was being useful. I remember he went to England, and one of the groups there that he was working with, when I asked him about his trip from England, the thing he was most happy about was he helped them figure out how to use their postage meter. They couldn't figure out a certain thing, and he was like, I helped them figure that out. He liked being useful, and I think that was one of the things that again, really was important to him. So he got a better reception from parents and interested adults. I mean, even the alternative school community, while they revered John, I think a lot of them, just didn't get the homeschooling thing. I know Herb Cole did, and he hates homeschooling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And look what we've done. We've turned our children into neurotics about, in Teach Your Own in 2003, when I revised it, I quote a UN study that shows British school children, 5 years old, were worried about passing their O-level tests. These tests were like years away from them, and they were worried about that because of their employment prospects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I can understand the melancholy. John saw that coming, but at the same time, he had some hope. He always had hope. And that was one of these weird things. It's like a lot of people say, oh, you don't have that, in-your-face thing that John did. It's like, yeah, well, John didn't have that when I knew him either.
Mm-hmm.
Privately, we would talk. Just like with Ivan, and privately, he would talk about how to, one of the reasons Ivan became a priest, he didn't want to bring children into this world. Mm-hmm. He thought that modern society was really bad, not worth bringing. He felt bad for children. That's one of the, that to me is an incredibly deep reason, really depressing, but that's how he felt, and John, by the way, never had children, but as he pointed out, not because he didn't try, it was because, he was sort of an eccentric character, he did ask women to marry him and they turned him down, so. One of the saddest things for me personally was when John was facing his death, and we went to a safe deposit box, and he was running through his stuff and asking, we're trying to figure out what he's going to give to who, and he pulled out this wedding ring that his grandmother had given him to give to his bride to be. And he just burst into tears, and he just said, "No wedding for Johnny, no wedding for Johnny." And I could see him crying. He was pretty upset, by some of the turns of his life. But and again, I've seen some really unfair things where people say, "Oh, well, what does he know about raising children?" And he would be the first to admit that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what. But unlike most parents who say, you probably get this, Jeremy. How can you be around your kids all that time? That drive me crazy. Well, John wanted to be. Some people want to be around their kids. They don't. They love it. And he was one of those people. And the idea that only if you walk in my shoes can you know what it's like. Well, yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. But it's also true that I can get help and ideas from people outside my situation. Sometimes that's really valuable to have. Mm-hmm. That I get, you get trapped in your own shoes sometimes. Sure. And so, that was one of the functions that John served. And I think for a lot of people, he was like an uncle or a grandpa that, that had some good advice or just was someone you could count on.
Right.